doing DeFi, greatest in the world, and they finally about to see why. What you know about XRD? I'm smart money, I ain't never on a decline. What you know about NFTs? It's not just Ace, when you finally gonna realize you need scalability, need more utility, then you better call on these guys. I'm going radical, I'm going Radix, I'm going radical, I'm going Radix. Hyperspeed DeFi, never on a decline, building the future, I feel like a savage.
Hello and welcome. I am Piers, CEO of RDX Works, a core developer of the decentralized finance protocol Radix, a public ledger entirely focused on bringing DeFi into the mainstream. This is our podcast, the DeFi Download, a show about decentralized finance and all things crypto, where we dive into the details of the projects, assets and services that are powering the DeFi revolution. Today, I have Pol Lansky, project lead at Dappnode. With Dappnode, now anyone can run decentralized networks like Ethereum and Bitcoin and earn rewards. Zero hassle, it just works, either as free software or plug-and-play hardware. Pol, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks to you for inviting, Piers. Really glad to be here.
So, where's this come from? Why do we need easy plug-and-play hardware or easy software to be able to run nodes? Why is anyone being able to run a node important?
Okay, cool. That's an excellent question. So let's get right into it. Picture yourself in 2017, and one of the founders, Jordi Bailina, also known for being part of the White Hat Group, the people who saved and rescued the money for the DAO hack.
I didn't realize it was Jordi. I've actually met Jordi before. Okay, yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So picture Jordi really involved into the independentist movement in Catalonia. So Catalonia is a part of Spain that there's a bunch of people that want to be independent, and there was a call for a referendum, and this was a referendum that was not sanctioned by the state, the Spanish state. So there was a bunch of websites and a bunch of promotion, like, let's do this referendum. We need to be able to decide whether we want to be independent or not. And the Spanish state went and told the ISPs, the internet service providers, that they shouldn't serve any of those websites. So they basically censored every website that had to do with the referendum. And Jordi, really into the centralized technologies as he was like, hey, I'm going to deploy these websites into IPFS, and everybody will be able to access these websites in a decentralized manner, which turned out to be an absolute failure because nobody had access to IPFS in the first place. So here's where he realized, hey, we're using all of these technologies, all of these decentralized technologies, but there is a bottleneck on the access of these technologies. How can we make it so universities, communities, social centers, they can run the centralized technologies themselves without having to rely with a point of centralization, namely, in the case of Ethereum, namely Infura, for example, which can censor our access if asked by the state or if sanctioned by the US sanction list on which countries you're allowed to give service to, etc., etc. And this is something that actually happens. Infura does geo-block some access to nodes currently. But back to 2017, Jordi was like, okay, we need a way for people that are non-technical, for people that care about the referendum in Catalonia and not about super technical DeFi or blockchain stuff, to be able to deploy blockchain nodes or decentralized network nodes. And that was the idea of Dappnode. How can we do better at making it easy for people to just deploy these nodes and then have their gateway to IPFS or to Ethereum or to Bitcoin or to whatever decentralized network you want?
Okay, so I mean, there's an intellectual leap here, which let's just make sure that we're understanding. So, IPFS is stands for Interplanetary File System, and it's a decentralized system for file storage. And you can do many things on it, including things like hosting websites or hosting files or hosting whatever, right? And so if I want to be able to access IPFS, I would expect just to be able to go to my browser and put in some kind of web address and then be able to resolve that to IPFS nodes and then get that. And now that's still in process, right? Like there aren't good ways of doing it. Some people have hacked some things together, but you could still, as an ISP, block that because you're resolving it to a website address before you're then resolving it to an IPFS address. So I get that.
That's right.
So now you're saying, okay, well, how can you give people who just have access to the internet as a starting point, the ability to be able to find files on within the internet? So how do you get from there to being like, oh, people need to be able to run their own nodes on something like Ethereum?
Right. So two parts here. One is we're mostly using gateways in order to access IPFS, right? So right now, the most famous one is .limo. So you put any website, any .eth domain that resolves into a website. For example, Ethereum.eth will bring you to the Ethereum, the official Ethereum Foundation website. And if you put .eth, actually, this is not an Ethereum address, and this is hosted in IPFS, so it'll not resolve unless you put .limo, which is an IPFS gateway. When you put .limo, you tell this gateway to go like, hey, this is an IPFS address. Go and check on IPFS where is that content, which you will find by resolving Ethereum.eth. And in the ENS domain, there's the IPFS hash. So that's how you can resolve it. So, and you are absolutely correct. If I try to access .limo is a company. Right. Is a company that if it's based in the States, for example, then if I am from Somalia, from Iran, or from North Korea, then you just are forced by law not to serve me. If my IP comes from there, .limo will not give me this service, right? So what can I do to access an IPFS domain? So if I have access to the internet, I could run an IPFS node. And when I run an IPFS node, I can go directly into the node and use the peer-to-peer discovery network of this node to access or to download the IPFS content.
Yep.
And then my browser will be able to resolve it.
Yep.
And because it'll be not accessing through a company, through a gateway, but directly from the node that I have in my computer.
Right.
Now, the technical barrier here is how the fuck do I run a, sorry about the swearing. How do I run an IPFS node?
Right.
And how do I maintain this IPFS node online? And the same way is for Ethereum. If I want to access and then query my balance on Infura and submit transactions on my MetaMask, I'm using Infura. Infura is just as .limo, it's a company. And it's forced by law not to serve me if my IP comes from North Korea, Iran, etc. So if I have my own Ethereum node by the internet, I from this Ethereum node, I can query the blockchain. I can ask my own Ethereum node, my decentralized network node. I can say, hey, what's my balance? And my node will know, is an up-to-date node. And through the peer-to-peer network, it connects to other nodes all over the world. Doesn't even care where it is. And it'll give me this information. And when I want to submit a transaction, I will submit it to my node, and my node will broadcast through Gossip, and my transaction will get out there. And that's what's similar with it, that both IPFS and Ethereum are node-based networks. And the nodes themselves, once I have access to a node directly, then these nodes can fetch the information without me needing any gateway, like Infura in the case of Ethereum or .limo in the case of IPFS.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting point, and I think that a lot of people don't really sort of completely understand this for decentralized networks, is that, you know, the only thing that you can really trust in a decentralized network, or like if you want to go all the way to the underlying state, like the information that's on the network, you need a computer that is part of running the system of the network. With IPFS, it's storing files and serving files. In Ethereum, it's running an Ethereum node, which is at least synchronizing with consensus. It doesn't necessarily have to be part of the consensus rounds, but it has to be running the Ethereum algorithm, and it has to be syncing up its database with the other nodes. And then that whole syncing process is its own way of checking and validating that what you're receiving is actually the correct state and is actually the true history of the ledger. But doing that is quite difficult. It requires, even the simplest nodes take a while to sync up. There's a bunch of like developer operations or logistics that have to be run to do that. And then you then have to be able to query against it if you want to be able to get the information out of it. And a lot of these nodes are not necessarily designed for querying, which is why you mentioned Infura. Why Infura services like Infura have grown up, because Infura just goes, okay, you can trust us. We'll sync with the network for you. We'll get the data state that you need, and we'll serve that up to you. And that's very useful if all you're trying to do is build a front end or build a wallet or something like that. That's a very useful service. And what Dappnode is essentially doing, if I understand correctly, is going, no, don't do that. Don't rely on a third-party service. Here's a really easy way of you being able to spin up a full node, or if you don't want to run a full node, as in if you don't want to be part of consensus rounds, but at least syncing with consensus, you can do that. And then you can always know that the information coming to you is the truth. Now, I can see why that's important for people who are on the full sort of libertarian end of things, where it is part of your philosophy of resiliency and decentralization that it is important to you that you run a node that you are getting the full valid state directly from the algorithms that are running consensus. What are you finding outside of that within sort of like the context of people just trying to build things within a Web3 or DeFi DApp or a wallet or whatever? Where are you finding that's also turning out to be useful as well?
Right. So first of all, I think you summarized it fantastically. And the Bitcoin community, which tends to have this sort of libertarian oomph to it, does many things wrong, but they do have very clear that the only way to get this true, this is something that's very interiorized by the entire Bitcoin community, right? Either if you want to trust verify, don't trust, right? That's like sort of one of the mantras that at least
trust
years ago.
But verify is normally how I hear it instead, which is
right.
Don't assume everyone's a dick, but make sure that they can't be at the same time.
But verify at software level, right? Exactly. So and you're absolutely correct, and I don't think I don't think Dappnode was born in any libertarian sort of breathing culture or anything like that. I think it was more on having the choice and having the option, and having the option. So if they can't, basically we don't have any beef against Infura, and we use it all the time, and Infura or any others, and this is a very, very legitimate option, which is extremely easy to use. But if you are to deploy a node for whatever reason, because you're being censored, because you are being scrutinized, because you want to be specifically private about what you do, and you don't want your queries and your addresses to be correlated by IPs, then you can use Dappnode. But you can't run a node yourself if you don't have all these DevOps knowledge, as you were saying, right? So Dappnode offers you this option. Now, Dappnode was a very niche product until validation came in, until proof of stake, until November 2020, when Genesis happened. And it stopped being a niche and it started being huge, because people do need to run this software themselves. You cannot trust a third party to run a validator for you. You can, obviously. You can use services like Lido, and you can use services like exchanges. But this is but there is a sort of like if you want to stake yourself and control your own keys and control your own ETH and do it yourself, you do need some sort of knowledge on how to maintain these nodes, how to maintain this software.
Right.
And basically what made Dappnode a more mainstream product, mainstream-ish product, was the fact that a lot of people could earn money with Dappnode.
Right.
Without intermediaries.
Right. So you get to keep more of the money that you are gaining, because obviously exchanges charge a fee and Lido charges a fee and all this kind of stuff. And when you say Genesis, you mean Ethereum started to move from proof of work to proof of stake.
Exactly. The genesis of the beacon chain. Sorry.
Right. So proof of work to proof of stake. This is obviously now Ethereum, big network, probably, I mean, it is the biggest proof of stake network in the world now, was said, okay, you can secure the network instead of as a Sybil protection mechanism, instead of proof of work, now proof of stake. So you have to put up some ETH against a validator node, and that validator node is then validating, is performing consensus on the Ethereum chain. And Ethereum also has this very strong philosophy around decentralization. Like one of the big things that they really tried to do and continue to try to do is make sure that the number of nodes that run consensus on the network, there are participants in the consensus that are part of the proof of stake validation, can be as many as possible. So yes, you could have a small number of nodes running the Ethereum consensus. There's nothing stopping you doing that. And you could conglomerate massive amounts of stake with those few number of nodes. The whole design of the algorithm was all around how do you make it as decentralized as possible? How do you maintain that possibility for decentralization? And actually, like, part of things like dank sharding and the stuff that's coming post the beacon chain actually really does focus on this idea of there being a large number of validators, not a small number, of a large number of validators, so they can deal with their sharding. So here comes the opportunity. If you have 32 ETH or more, you can run a validator, and that validator node will earn fees directly from you being able to run, be able to stake to secure the network. And I think with Ethereum, they didn't go down the delegated proof of stake route, particularly for this reason, right? They went, we want there to be, if you stake, you have to validate, and either you're trusting your stake with someone else or you're putting your stake on a node or a computer that you're running. So Ethereum's kind of forced this upon how everyone interacts with the ledger, which is where now we're getting to Dappnode. Dappnode comes in and goes, well, actually, it's quite difficult to run a node, and so we're going to make it easier. So let's start with from the idea that people don't know what running a node involves. Can you paint a picture before Dappnode came along, what involved to just run an Ethereum node?
Right. So before Dappnode came along, so right now, it's even more complicated. But before Dappnode, you only needed to run an execution layer, what now is called an execution layer node, which was an ever-growing piece of software that validates all the transactions, makes sure that the transactions that are being put into the blockchain that you received are actually valid, et cetera, et cetera. And that was anywhere from 400 gigabytes to, I think when Dappnode was there, was already at 400 gigabytes, or maybe a little bit less. But yeah, it's basically like a 400 gigabyte and growing machine. We're now around 600 to 800, depending on the implementation, 600 to 800 gigabytes for a full node. An archive node will set you back minimum 2 terabytes with Aragon, and if you use any other implementation, it's like from 4 terabytes upwards. So it's huge in terms of this requirement, because you cannot have this in very cheap storage. You cannot have this in very cheap storage like one of these HD disks that actually have disks, because the input and output speed is not enough to keep up with the input and output data that validating a node requires. Right. So you actually need expensive disks in order to keep that in sync.
Yep.
And with an SSD is okay, but mostly you need an NVMe disk, which is like the top tier for you to be lofty in terms of like, okay, I'm not going to lose
16 lines of PCIe bandwidth rather than like just like your normal data bus. Yeah.
Exactly. It's you need like a little. I mean, it's not that like an M2 disk, an M2 connection will work fantastically, fabulously. Like that's enough. But yeah, like, or an SSD, like a SATA with SSD, that works as well. It's
Well,
just like the right thing.
M2 is actually on your PCIe bus. I only know this because I built storage in a previous live. But yes, it's PCIe. It's just a specialized connector.
Right.
But yeah, like, okay, so and this is something that people didn't realize. I think that many people don't realize is that one of the things that limits the throughput of Ethereum is actually your IO bound on your node.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah,
like a lot of people think that it's like, oh, you know, it's signing or it's like messaging. It's not. It's the IO bound of the disk. And so like that's why you need this specialty hardware. Okay, so you need the specialty hardware. What else?
But it's not specialty hardware. Like let's not like it is kind of like, but let's blow it out of proportion. Like an SSD disk will work. But if you're validating, for example, if you want to have a validator, you really want to over-engineer this stuff because any downtime is problematic. It's not very problematic because, as you very well said, it's been designed to be friendly to solo stakers. You're not expected to be 100% of the time online. The penalties for being offline, they're very small. So it's very forgiving for solo stakers. It's actually really easy. But it's not forgiving for huge stakers, for example. It has in the protocol, it has like this thing called correlation penalties, which it means that if you're running a data center and the data center goes down and you have like thousands of validators in there, the penalty gets a multiplier by all the other validators that were offline at the same time. And this is meant to penalize people aggregating and concentrating this validation operations, and it's meant to incentivize people to distribute as maximum as possible. So as you very much well said before, Ethereum is designed to be as decentralized as possible.
Yep.
So before Dappnode came along, like you also need, there's also like the hardware part, which right now what you need is like 2 terabyte NVMe disk, 32 gigs of RAM, and an i3 processor. Processor is actually very easy, like an i3 or i5 or i7. With any processor would work. That's not the problem. And we're mostly recommending Intel NUCs. So you can install this in an Intel NUC because it's a very, very reliable machine. It's a small format factor. It's meant to be online all of the time, which is exactly what you want in a validator, to be online all of the time. Not like a laptop, for example, which will overheat, you can't have a validator in a laptop. So yeah, that's what we're recommending. This is what you would need. But then there's that's on the hardware requirements. But then there's like, okay, this is software that wasn't even created before Genesis, and it's been like built as we speak.
Right.
So Prism, which is one of the most used consensus layer implementations, pulled out 20 updates last year, and in 12 months. So you need to update this 20 times. You need to be really on top of it 20 times. Plus Geth, which is the most common implementation of an execution layer, which you need to run both in order to run a validator, churned out 16 updates. Now, we're getting into 36 software updates, both in execution and consensus layer, which, you need some DevOps ability to just keep doing this while you're running a validator. So while this is like, you don't want any off time on that. And yeah, basically like it's a pain in the ass. So what Dappnode does is Dappnode takes care of all the updating. Dappnode is Docker based, and it sort of like manages your containers and manages the updates. And we test it first. And once we push in an update to all the Dappnodes out there, it's because it's been tested, and it'll auto update automatically without you having to do any maintenance of that node or any of this 36 updates a year that you would have to do otherwise.
Okay, so so basically all of that work of when an update comes in, running the update, checking to make sure that it's updated correctly and it's running correctly, like going back to the previous version if it's not, all of that kind of stuff. That's all managed for you via this software. And you also have the option I see on your website to be able to buy the hardware that you need as well. So you can either just buy the hardware with the software up and running. And is it guaranteed to always be like up to date and running? Like what kind of guarantees do you have around once you've got this software in place?
Well, the guarantees are that we have skin in the game. Like we are running all our validators in Dappnode. So, and we're a team that's been around for a very long time. So if we screw up, I mean, our validators screw up as well. So we're definitely not incentivized to have that. There's no official guarantee. There's nothing that we state like you get your money back, because we don't think we need that. Like our validators are running. We do have the skin in the game.
Yep.
That's pretty much it.
Sure, but I mean, in terms of like, if I get this piece of software and hardware, or just piece of software, like within what time frame do you typically do the update? Within what time frame? Like
Right. Yeah. So that's actually like we're working more and more with the teams, with the execution, and consensus implementer teams, and now we're working to integrate them. To integrate this into their own deployment processes. So, for example, for the Nethermind clients, we don't even do the downstream integration. One of their distributions, they distribute their nodes as a binary, as Docker, and as Dappnode. Then they take care of this themselves. So, fantastic. And we're working more and more with client implementer teams in order to do exactly that, for us not to be downstream integrators, but just platform providers. And this is the platform that this is one more distribution platform that they have for people to use their software.
Awesome. And so like once I've got up and running and I'm staking my ETH, obviously like knowing what's happening on the network, knowing what how my staking's doing becomes important. People like looking at these things. Have you guys done anything around dashboarding?
Right, this is an excellent question. So there's a lot of open source work on dashboarding your own information.
Right.
And there's a lot of Grafana and Prometheus tools that you can use, and we do integrate them. So you can actually like monitor your own node and stuff. Of course, like you can monitor your own node and your own validator through an explorer, like a beacon chain explorer, like beacon chain.
Yeah.
And then you can create your dashboard of validators, but then you can go more on the nitty-gritty of like how it is by integrating these open source dashboards that we have integrated in your Dappnode, right? So you can get this information directly there. One important thing to mention here about Dappnode is that since everything is open source, it's an open ecosystem. So if I am a Dappnode runner and I have an idea or an improvement to make on a dashboard or something like that, or somebody has done an amazing dashboard and I want to use it in my Dappnode, I basically can build it with a couple of commands with our SDK. So it's an open system and everybody can contribute with this. And that's exactly how the dashboards were created. The dashboards that we have, the Grafana dashboards that we have, they were created by a user going like, hey, it would be super cool to have this on Dappnode, boom. And then they created this. And now almost everybody that running a validator also runs this.
That's really cool. And how about staking? Is there a staking dashboard as well?
Yes. So the fun thing here is that the implementer teams can barely agree on anything, right? And and we actually created we pushed the key manager API, which was a standard in order to manage keys between different parties, because every client implementation had their own way of managing keys and passing them around.
Right.
Validator keys, that is.
Right.
And we actually pushed with DabLion, who is now team lead at Lodestar, so one of the consensus layer implementations, but he was before in Dappnode, and he started by going like, this is nuts. Like let's have like an API so clients can exchange keys. And we actually run into this trouble because we were trying to make a UI that you could use to manage your validators, right? And this UI, like Prism was the only client with a UI. And this UI wouldn't connect to any other because the commands were different, and like you could not pass keys from one place to the other. It was a nightmare. So we're like, hey, we need a UI because our sort of like selling proposition is that you don't need command line. You can do everything with drag and drop. That's how you manage your keys. You can do like and actually you can't. So let's set up a way of managing key. And we sort of like did that, and we're trying to do the same with metrics right now, with like staking keys. So basically, to respond to your question, it depends. Like staking metrics, well, it depends on which client implementation do you use.
Right.
But yeah.
Okay. So there will be some and there will be more.
Exactly.
I'd love to also sort of talk a little bit around 32 ETH was always considered to be, for Ethereum, was always considered. I remember when Ethereum first started, and it was 10,000 ETH that was going to be the staking amount. So the Ethereum Foundation were very proud about the fact that they got all the way down to 32 ETH, but 32 ETH is still a lot of money. So if you want to join the decentralized revolution and start running nodes, but 32 ETH is a little bit far away from you, do you guys have any like solutions to that as well?
Right. Yes. So I'm really glad you asked that, because in 20, like up until now, our trajectory has been to make it accessible for everybody without any technical knowledge, to make the centralized networks accessible. So we can say like we've been like an agent of technological accessibility, right? And DEF CON this year, 2016, was kind of like a confirmation for us that this has been actually the case. A lot of people came like, hey, I'm running my nodes, this is amazing. I did in testnet, like, wow, that's been great. Dappnode works great. Something that's for a project that's completely open source and bootstrapped, like it's it's kind of cool to get this recognition. But we realized that 32 ETH, so right next to the venue, the DEF CON venue in Bogota, there was an advertisement. And I can't remember how many million pesos that was, but it was exactly 32 ETH. Like, and it was a luxury apartment in that part of town. It was a luxury apartment costs 32 ETH in Colombia.
Right.
And most people that came there, like a luxury apartment that we would say, well, like, I don't know, maybe I'm not going to talk about like demographics. I actually don't know, but like probably not everybody that was at DEF CON could afford that luxury apartment, right? So much less a validator.
Yeah.
So I think for us in 2023 is going to be the year of economic accessibility. There's many tools that are being born right now in order to be able to distribute keys and to create sort of like allow people with less than 32 ETH to offer their hardware for validation in exchange of obviously a part of the benefits of this validation. And this is extremely important, because if we say that decentralization has always been a priority for Ethereum, but then we require this 32 ETH, we have a lower limit to decentralization, right? Like we can only decentralize up limit. To exactly, yeah. There's this lower bound that we cannot decentralize on demographics below this line. Sure. But now we can, and distributed validator technology, DVT, will allow us to break down keys into different pieces, which you couldn't do before. Before, you wouldn't trust anybody with your validator key because they could do things like double signing and slash you, and then you'd lose all your money. And you much less would do that with random strangers on the internet.
Sure.
Like you would barely do that with a friend. Like, here's my validator, here, take it, please take good care of it.
Right.
You'd be quite nervous about this. But much less with random strangers on the internet that say like, hey, I don't have 32 ETH, but I do have a spare machine and an internet connection. Mm-hmm. How can I contribute? Mm-hmm. Well, now you can, because we've come up with this, and I don't mean Dappnode. I mean, like, the ecosystem has come up with this DVT concept, which you break down keys and you turn them into like effectively a multi-sigs.
Yeah.
Like none of these keys has the power of neither signing anything good nor bad. So you actually can start trusting more people with chunks of keys, and you can distribute this among more people.
It sounds a little bit like mining pools did for Bitcoin, right? Which had its own detractors from the point of view of reversing the decentralization trend. I mean, a lot of these like low level debates is why we ultimately decided for Radix to go with DPoS rather than proof of stake directly, just because we were like, there's so many and difficult different things that you have to consider, and they all have their own pluses and minuses. But it's really interesting that now that is becoming possible, regardless of whether or not POS or DPoS is the right end state. It's interesting that's now becoming possible. And so when can we expect sort of Dappnode, that to be available via Dappnode for people who are thinking, hey, I'd like to get involved, but I don't have $40,000 to spend on 32 ETH?
So we're already doing that in testnet in Gurley with what's called an LSD network.
LSD.
And LSD stands for
if you lick it, then you start seeing colors.
Popular drug in the 60s. No, I'm joking. LSD stands for Liquid Staking Derivative Network.
Right.
And a liquid staking derivative is a place where you can just drop your ETH,
sure,
and you get a derivative of this ETH back. And then the ETH that's in this pool can go into different validators, and we'll start extracting.
So it's basically like Lido, but the validator network itself is decentralized.
Correct.
Right.
Yes, exactly. And there are a couple of projects working on that model. And one of them is the BlockSwap team and their stake and their product Stakehouse that includes an LSD network. Another one is Stakewise V3. Stakewise is one of the big staking pools, and they're also trying to push for decentralization. And Stakewise V3 actually allows for people to pool their hardware and receive validators from people that want to just drop their ETH. So it's kind of recognize there's two actors or two different profiles in the ecosystem. Right. Those who can run nodes and those who have the ETH but they can't be bothered running nodes or whatever it is. So they act as a sort of a matchmaking sort of protocol. And so in Gurley, we're already working with the BlockSwap team, and we do have a liquid staking derivative network, an LSD network on Gurley.
Right.
And but I think the brilliant thing here is that we don't even need to do anything. All these protocols are allowing users to do it themselves. And Dappnode is sort of the enabler for anybody to use these protocols. You can install this in your Dappnode and start participating in these networks. And if you want to create your own staking business, if you're really good at marketing, but you have no idea about DevOps, you could set up ideally an infrastructure business by using Dappnodes, right? You could just set up a few Dappnodes and then start marketing your liquid staking derivative network, and people would just give you their ETH, and you could just deploy these ETH into validators on those Dappnodes without any technical knowledge. And that's a little bit what we're going to do, and a little bit disintegrations. And a little bit the kind of magic here is that the people that are running validators themselves as well, that's also interesting for them, because marginally the cost of running an extra validator is negligible. Once you have set up your execution client, your consensus client, and your validator software, putting one more key in there is basically nothing. So once you have this set up, then you can start receiving this. Some of those protocols will require collateral, so you'll still need 1-2 ETH as collateral to make sure that you don't cheat the system or that you're just not doing anything and accruing rewards, etc. But the sort of like you will be able to start validating with these protocols with like very, very small collateral. And we're talking like 4 ETH for some, 1 ETH for some others, etc.
Really, really cool. Really, really cool. It's been fascinating talking with you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. If people want to like find out more about Dappnode, where should they go and how can they get involved?
Right. So dappnode.com, that's like the place where they're going to find everything. But mostly you get a feel of what the community is if you drop by our Discord. So the Dappnode Discord, which you'll find a link in dappnode.com. The Dappnode Discord will get you a feel of what are all of these node runners up to? Why would you run a node? What are they doing? If it's easy or not, what kind of like support questions do they have? We have an amazing community of people running their nodes, and they help each other a lot. So that's where I would go.
That's awesome. Paul, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Piers. It has been excellent.
You better call on these guys. I'm going radical, I'm going Radix, I'm going radical, I'm going Radix. Hyperspeed DeFi, never on a decline. Building the future, I feel like a savage.